I'm Natalie Jones. I'm Executive Vice President of Meridian.
I'm Stuart Holliday, the CEO of Meridian International Center. Welcome. You're on the campus of Meridian International Center, but this was not always a campus. These homes were built in the early 20th century for returning ambassadors who served in the United States Foreign Service in Europe principally. Erwin Laughlin built the Meridian House, and Ambassador Henry White built what is now known as the White-Meyer House. The White-Meyer House was built on top of Meridian Hill, as was the Meridian House. Meridian Hill is named Meridian Hill because 16th Street, which we are on, is one of the main meridians, geographic meridians in the United States, and in fact bifurcates the White House. At a point in history, the United States was considering creating its own time based upon this meridian as opposed to the Greenwich Mean Time from the Naval Observatory.
In the late 1800s, early 1900s, all of this area was just farmland. And even before then, this area was a former Civil War base camp. But in the early 1900s, a woman, Mary Foote Henderson, she was the wife of Senator John Henderson, had this vision. And she had this vision of developing this area and led Washington's City Beautiful movement. It was because of her that this area really transformed into, at that time, the Embassy Row and Diplomatic Quarter. She helped to lead the movement. She actually built a property just a few blocks away from this home. It was called the Henderson Castle. So at the time before these homes were built, this neighborhood was really one of the most prominent neighborhoods in Washington.
So the White-Meyer House, as it's known, was built first. John Russel Pope, the famous architect, who also designed the National Gallery of Art, the National Archives, and the Jefferson Memorial, among others, was commissioned by Ambassador White to build his home in a neoclassical style. It's a brick home with incredible detail, incredible ironwork, friezes, and Ambassador White was obviously very wealthy. He had been ambassador to France and Italy and came from a prominent industrial family. His wife, Margaret Rutherford White, was painted famously by John Singer Sargent. Her full-length portrait is hanging in the National Gallery of Art. Ambassador White was a very important diplomat, not only for his work as an ambassador, but he was also very close to President Wilson. And during the First World War and the conclusion of that war, he accompanied Wilson to France, where they negotiated the peace agreement and tried to establish the League of Nations. I think significantly before the war, or before the US entered the war in 1917, the French ambassador who lived right up the street, Ambassador Jusserand, who was a very famous diplomat who was here for 2 decades, very close to President Teddy Roosevelt, but was still here. At the time, they were renovating the French embassy, and so Ambassador White offered his home to the French government as the site of the conference in 1917, which led to the United States entering the First World War. At that time, the Allies, the French and the British, were in a stalemate with the Germans, and so therefore this house is viewed as also a significant place by the French government. After the end of the First World War, Ambassador White lived there for a few years and ultimately sold the house to Eugene Meyer of the famous Meyer family from New York. Eugene Meyer moved to Washington and bought the Washington Post. He had been a very successful investment banker, and he's also known as the father to a very famous woman, Katharine Graham. Katharine Graham lived in the house her entire childhood for 17 years and had I would say, a very splendid environment to grow up in, but also one which was somewhat set apart from friends and perhaps peers. She went to Madeira School in Virginia, which was quite far at the time. But nonetheless, the house was the scene of many of Washington's social gatherings when Eugene Meyer lived here. Presidents, senators, ambassadors, visiting dignitaries, business leaders. And it's somewhat similar to the role that Meridian plays today as a convener in Washington. The Laughlin family, which was a very prominent Pittsburgh steel family, decided to also hire Pope to build this French Hotel Particulier in detail, limestone, incredibly accurate in symmetry to a French home in the style of the late 18th century, early 19th century. If you follow Pope, you realize as an architect that symmetry and accuracy was very important. He didn't necessarily try to impose his own stamp on a particular design. He tried to look for what would be the classical proportions required for the building. And you can see this if you compare the National Gallery of Art and its proportions, which he designed, to its neighboring building, the Natural History Museum. Both have domes, both have columns. They're similar in scale, but one is proportionally, in the classical architectural terms, accurate, and that was Pope's hallmark. So the Laughlin family lived here. Ultimately, their descendants, the Chandlers, lived here as well. And they also had, as did White, cottages, what are called cottages in Newport, Rhode Island, which were in fact splendid homes for the wealthiest people to escape the heat. And the Meridian House is also known for its linden garden. Linden trees have sort of a magical quality to them. There have been waltzes written about dancing unter den Lindens. It's quite an extraordinary tree that forms a canopy that almost looks like a ceiling during the summer of complete coverage. And then in the winter, the trees almost look like sculptures of creatures with fists upheld to the sky, and they're quite dramatic. Paintings above the doorways are original French 19th century and possibly some 18th century paintings, landscapes and scenes that if they were taken and put into frames and hung on the walls, they would be in and of themselves masterworks. The book collection we have in the library is really a combination of rare books from both Ambassador White and Ambassador Laughlin, and a gift of a collection of books on foreign affairs from the late Ambassador Warren Zimmerman, who served as the last ambassador to Yugoslavia before its breakup in the early 90s.
Diplomacy is no longer conducted between governments. You think about the time of Ambassador Laughlin and Ambassador White, and the act of negotiating and carrying out international affairs was really limited to the government and to these designated envoys. They're actually considered ambassadors extraordinary and plenipotentiary, because plenipotentiary means that they have vested in them the authority to act on behalf of their country when they were serving abroad. That really started to change after World War II, when we see the advent of more travel, of media and communication, and governments realize that they are able to influence other governments by influencing the publics of those governments. So the US government started working on international exchange programs and public diplomacy programs, cultural diplomacy programs, and really this peaked in the late 1950s, early 1960s at the height of the Cold War. I think everyone is familiar with the Jazz Ambassadors program, where the US government sent music icons like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong around the world on tours to really win, again, the hearts and minds of publics around the world. And I think another important role that we've really evolved into is we're really the hub for the diplomatic community in Washington. If you walk into Meridian, it feels like an embassy. We work with almost 180 ambassadors and embassies in Washington and help connect them to public and private sector leaders so they can collaborate on challenges. We give them insight into the political, economic, and social landscape of the United States. We've been here as an organization for almost 65 years, but we are still this kind of hidden gem. I see people who come in for the first time, these two big imposing doors open, they see the red carpet lined stairs, and you can almost see them stand up a little bit straighter. You're almost kind of walking back in time to a place and to a period when Washington was a little bit more civil. Really, at the end of the day, these two historic buildings really create this environment for diplomacy to flourish. And it's really this oasis and haven in the middle of Washington. And I think I speak for everybody on this team when we say that we're so proud to work for Meridian as an organization, but also are really stewards of the importance of these two buildings in our mission.
I think one of the most interesting things about this place, Meridian International Center and the two homes, the White-Meyer House, the Meridian House, is the fact that really since their inception, they have been grounds of diplomacy, built by ambassadors, reminiscent of embassies, used for diplomatic purposes, even prior to the creation of this center in 1960. So what you've seen, which is very rare, I think, is in Washington is a continuum from 1915 to 2025 of these homes as places that are not simply pretty to look at, but they advance and perform a mission of bringing international leaders together to try to bring different points of view together.
I would like to think that if Ambassador Laughlin and Ambassador White were alive today, that they would be so pleased with how their homes really have become and have really gone on to embody what they worked for their entire careers.